Evening. I'm going to tell you a story. This story tonight is a little different because I didn't find it in an old newspaper or Google research or asking somebody about it in a gas station or pulling anything from a haunted book at a library. No, you see, it's different because I actually grew up hearing this story, many of these stories. My whole family did, really. And even now, there are nights I lie awake and I still think about that old house. And I wonder what was living upstairs. We always called him the old man. My grandparents used to live in an old house in the backwoods of North Carolina. It wasn't the kind of house you would drive past and immediately think, hey, I bet that's a haunted house. There were no broken windows, no, cobwebs or no graveyards out back. There were no strange symbols carved into the walls. It was just an old family home. And it was that house where everybody gathered. Christmas time, Sunday afternoons, and specifically for this story, sleepovers. I spent most of my childhood there growing up. And for as long as I can remember, everybody knew about the old man. But nobody really knew who he or it was. Nobody knew if somebody had died in the house or any story attached to it or any name that could have been attached to this thing. But something was there. And according to my family, it liked the upstairs attic. Now, when I say upstairs, the house had two levels, a downstairs and an upstairs, but then you had the loft, the attic where you would pull the old stair door, the old stairs down from the door. That's what I refer to as upstairs, the attic. It wasn't a finished room. It was just an old attic. It's where they stored all of their Christmas decorations. It was dark, musty, full of cobwebs. It was so hot in the summer. It was frigid cold in the winter. You just didn't go up there. Boxes were shoved into the corner, old clothes and what have you. But whenever somebody had to pull those old stairs down, they didn't stay up there long. I can still hear the creak of that door opening and the stairs being pulled down. It just felt wrong. You know that feeling when you walk into a room and immediately it feels like somebody was just there? Well, that was the attic. And there's no over-exaggeration with this claim. It felt like they were still there. Like you were always being watched. The first stories I remember about the house were the footsteps. They usually happened at night, but there were a lot of times it happened in the day. Somebody would be sitting in the living room downstairs or in the main room, or they would hear somebody either walking in the attic or in the hallway. It was slow, gradual footsteps. Not little creaks from old house settling. The house was old, but it had settled. It was just footsteps, one right after another. So normal sounding, so heavy, that it just sounded like grandma or grandpa walking through the house. You could follow them with your ears. They would go from one end of the hallway to the other end, and then it would just abruptly stop. And sometimes outside one of the bedrooms. The strange part was everybody that would be in the house at that particular time that you would hear it, they were downstairs. You had my grandparents, my mom, my two sisters, me if I was there, my dad, my uncles. Like I said, this was a centralized family gathering house, and when we were all together, we could all be accounted for. But somebody was still walking upstairs. Now, I also want to say that we had a large family, and when we would all gather, we didn't hear it. There was only a few times we would all hear them with a few people in the house. Now, who's up there? That's what who's up there? We would go and check. They would always usually try to send me to go, being the youngest, and because I was scared, I didn't want to go investigate, but I would, and I would always see the same thing. Nothing. I would go check as fast as I could, open the doors, and as I'm opening doors, turning lights on, even in daytime, nothing. Empty. The bedroom doors were closed even. There's nobody there hiding, and there was nothing ever out of place. Except for one time. But that's another story for another session. And then we would just go back downstairs. I would go down there, hey, I didn't see anything. And then they would all have the same joke. Oh, I bet it was the old man. And I'd just be like, I don't want to hear about it. A few minutes later, sometimes the footsteps would start again. Now, a lot of people would say, well, is there rats in the attic? Is there bats flying around or birds? Maybe they're hitting the joists or the floors or what have you. But that was never the case. It was checked. Now, the next part of this story happened different parts of the time was when my grandpa had some experiences with footsteps and shadows. Now, my grandpa had several experiences, and I'll just touch on a couple. His were worse. The bathroom in that house had a door that opened toward the hallway. And many times, my grandpa had told us that when he would go to take a bath, from where he sat in the tub, he could see light from under the hallway or under the door into the hallway beneath and around that doorway. And like I said, this happened more than one occasion. He always saw someone walking past the door. He never saw a face, and he never saw like physical feet, not like a person standing there, just the shadow. It was in the shape of legs and feet, a human walking under the door. You could see the light, the shadows. And he thought someone was in the house. He would call out, who was that? Or he even told me, I remember this vividly, he would say, I'll be out in just a minute. But nobody would ever answer. Now, this would be a lot of times when my grandma would be gone shopping and he would be home alone. So, he would finish his bath, he'd dry off, he would get decent enough to be able to walk out and find out that no one was there. This one time, he was sitting in the bathtub one of the evenings, and the house was quiet. And the bathroom door was shut, and while he was sitting there, again, a shadow passed the door. Slowly. Not something or someone running past, it was taking its time. It wasn't a trick of headlights from outside because it was still daylight enough. Now, it was a person, or something like a person, just walking down the hallway. My grandpa had gotten used to this occurrence to where he would just sit there and just stare at the door. He would wait for footsteps. A lot of times nothing would happen and he would wash and get out, but then the shadow would sometimes come back. My grandpa would call out, again, no answer, and he even got kind of confident sometimes, and he would joke and say, all right, old man, I'll be out in a minute. You know the drill. He'd get out of the tub and he'd open the door, and again, he'd look, nothing, no one, everything's still in place. Of course, he would tell my grandma about it or us about it, and we would just laugh it off or say, Grandpa, you were on your own. We were not there. But he always had it in his head. He knew, and we later come to find out because of our own experiences that he was experiencing something real, not made up. And according to him, not only would he see the footsteps under the door, he would hear something move above him in the attic. It would go one step closer and then another, and then silence. But that's when the family really started calling him the old man, not Grandpa, the entity or whatever it was. Nobody remembers exactly who came up with the name. We think it was my grandpa. I always called him Pawser. That was my Pawser, my pawpaw. Maybe somebody once thought that they saw an outline of an older man. I don't know. But that's just, every time I hear the stories from my childhood up until now, it's just always been the old man. And even being candid with you about a lot of this stuff now is it's got a heaviness to it, because it brings back the very real experiences, the childhood that we had, that I had. But again, it would be a joke if something was moved or misplaced, or you saw a noise, or you heard a noise, or saw a shadow or figure. Oh, it was the old man. The old man did it. Can't find your wallet. The old man moved it. You know, stuff like that. And a lot of times that's how stories and legends are brought up through families and loved ones. But you know, sometimes the easiest way to live with something strange is just to give it a name. At least that's what I've always heard and experienced growing up as far as this account goes. But you know, just pretend that it makes things less frightening. But it didn't. My sisters used to have sleepovers with their little girlfriends over at the house, at Grandma's house, especially around Halloween. They would have their, you know, bunch of girls come over. You had their sleeping bags on the floor. They were playing Thriller and Monster Mash and all of the Halloween classic hits and stuff. They had candy, pizza, movies, all of the stuff, you know, flashlights. And it was the kind of night where everybody is already trying to scare everybody else. And at that house, they usually succeeded, because even when you would visit on a normal day, separate from Halloween, it was still spooky to a lot of people, because again, they're hearing the stories of the old man. And so one particular Halloween, it was late, all the girls were there doing the Halloween party thing. My grandparents were gone for a while, but then they would later come home and go to bed upstairs, not attic upstairs, but second floor upstairs. And most of the girls were still awake. They're whispering, trying to do urban legend challenges like Bloody Mary or the Candy Man, you know, where you go into the bathroom and look into the mirror and say Bloody Mary 3 times. And everyone was just getting freaked out, you know, but they were whispering and laughing. Then they heard something in the attic. It sounded like a thud. They all went so quiet. Then came the footsteps, slowly moving down the hallway. One step, another, and then another. One of the girls whispered that maybe Grandma was awake. Maybe Grandpa just had to get up and go to the bathroom. Then they heard his snoring from the bedroom. They knew it wasn't him, but the footsteps continued. They were heavy, like they would have been his. They moved toward the staircase, and then they stopped. Every girl in the room was staring at the stairs. Nothing came down, and they sure as heck were not going toward it. They waited. They were petrified. A minute passed, and then probably 2. And then finally, one of the girls laughed nervously and said, "Oh, it's the old man." But nobody laughed back. See, my sisters were used to saying things like that to combat the fear that we were having with this stuff. Then something knocked from the attic. 3 times. Just a knock, knock, knock. One of my sisters yelled for my grandparents, and Grandma came out, turned the rest of the lights on, because the girls had turned on as many as they could around them without having to go into a separate room. And Grandma's asking, you know, what was wrong? Calm down. What was wrong? And they told her that somebody was in the attic. They're all frantic and borderline panic attacks at this point. My grandma actually pulled on the attic string of the door, releasing the ladder, the steps, and a bunch of toilet paper had fallen. Like, it was stacked up. It was toilet paper and paper towels. They were on the door. It all came falling. Now, there's no possible way that it could have been stacked on there, because when you open that door, you have to have the access of the entryway to push the storage in the sides or in the front or in the back. So they tried to just explain that away. That was just one of the many things that would happen at their classic Halloween sleepovers. My grandma tried to comfort them and just dismiss it and say, listen, you got too worked up. It's Halloween time. You're telling too many ghost stories. Go back to sleep. So eventually, they all did settle back down. But later that night, one of the girls woke up. She didn't scream, at least not at first. She just laid there, frozen, because somebody or something was standing at the top of the stairs. She could only see the shape, a dark figure, tall, thin build, watching the living room where all the girls were sleeping. She thought that it was my grandpa, but he was actually not as tall as this shadow, and he was way more burlier than this figure. She whispered my grandpa's name, but the figure didn't move at all. Then the hallway light came on behind it, and there was nobody there. She screamed so loud, everybody woke up. It was at this point that a lot of the girls wanted to go home, but this was a time in the late 90s when most of these girls, they didn't have cell phones. Maybe a couple did, but they didn't have it to the point of texting or calling, at midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning. We had a landline there. So they all eventually went back to sleep. Another sleepover ended with something even stranger, because as you recall, this was a normal occurrence. This was a ritual, a tradition that my sisters would do at Grandma and Grandpa's house on Halloween. Nobody wanted to go near the attic that we have since talked about. So eventually, one of them got brave enough. She took a flashlight, walked upstairs into the hallway where the attic entry was on the ceiling. She went to pull the string for the door to open the door and release the ladder, and then she ran back downstairs as fast as she could, pale as a ghost, and they were asking, "What's wrong? What's wrong?" And she stood there shaking, saying, "Someone whispered my name." Was it any of you? Did you try to whisper my name? Are you just trying to scare me? But it was right beside my ear. But see, when she's saying this, she was hysterical. Nobody believed her. They thought she was trying to scare them, not the other way around. Then another girl went upstairs to that same place. She made it halfway into the hallway, and then she stopped and came straight back down. Now, she wouldn't say what happened. Not until many years later, actually, when telling my sister, who then told me. According to her, when she reached the hallway, she heard heavy breathing coming from above her, from the attic. It was slow, again heavy, like a man out of breath. Then something scratched across the attic floor directly over her head. That night when it happened, she never went upstairs alone again, and actually, this girl never returned to any other sleepovers. Now, there were plenty other stories. There were little things, a bedroom door that would slowly open after someone closed it, things falling upstairs when nobody was there, the sound of somebody sitting on an old bed, floorboards creaking in rooms that nobody was using, the feeling of always being watched, whether you were alone in that house or you had people there. It always felt like something invisible was watching. Once, somebody swore they saw a man standing at the end of the hallway just for a second. An old man. Now, I'm not talking about what we just referenced at the Halloween sleepover. This was another instance. Dark figure, a man's shape about him, the face hidden in shadow. Then he just vanished. Years passed. All of us grandkids grew up, moved off with our own families, and eventually Grandma and Grandpa actually moved out of the house as well, where later Grandpa passed away, and then another residency came in and took over that house that's not attached to the family. It's just different people. The strange thing is, after everybody moved off and time passed, nobody ever really talked about the old man following them. My grandparents never started hearing footsteps in their new house. My grandpa never saw the shadow walking past the bathroom again in their new house. There was no attic noises because in this new house there were no attics. There was no doors opening on their own. There was nothing. Just grandma, grandpa, and the family would come and visit. So whatever had been in the old house potentially stayed there. And maybe that's a part of the story that still kind of irks me. Because growing up, you could convince yourself there was an explanation. You know, old pipes, old floors, whatever you want to say. And then the joking of, oh, it's the old man. But when my grandparents moved, the stories just stopped. Not gradually, they just stopped. As if the old man had never belonged to my family at all. He belonged to the house. And when everybody left, he simply stayed behind. Sometimes I wonder about the people who live there now, currently. You know, if anything ever goes on. I wonder if anybody ever told them or if they've had their own experiences. Maybe they've just kind of found out for themselves. I speculate and put them in my position of what we experienced. You know, are they sitting downstairs right now watching TV? The house is completely quiet. Everyone else is in bed. And above them, a floorboard creaked. Then maybe another. Slow footsteps moving through the hallway. Maybe they got up and checked upstairs. Maybe they had no reason to not check the attic because nothing had happened in the past to them. So they looked and they found nothing. Maybe a few nights later, somebody took a bath and they watched the shadow of a man walk past the bathroom door. Maybe their kids started complaining about noises in the attic, and maybe they had Halloween sleepovers. Maybe, if they were experiencing things, somebody in that family gave him a name too. I don't know. I just know what my family called him, what I called him, the old man. And according to the stories I heard my entire childhood, he was there long before I understood why an empty hallway could be so frightening. And for all I know, he's still there walking now, passing that bathroom door, waiting upstairs in the dark. Because again, my grandparents moved out of that house years ago, but the old man never did. Let me know your thoughts about this story in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story or found it unsettling and frightening, don't you worry. There are plenty more stories like this lurking in the darkness of Walker Hollow. Make sure you subscribe, and we'll see you next week.